The house had an undeniable charm to it, a beauty that only comes with age and history. The wallpaper, though peeling, was intricately patterned, and each creak of the floorboards felt like a whisper from another time. I'd been drawn to it instantly, charmed by its high ceilings, elegant archways, and the towering oak trees that framed the yard. Despite the low price, oddly low now that I thought about it, the place felt like a fresh start. I spent the first week settling in, cleaning dusty corners, painting walls, and imagining the life I'd build here. It was peaceful, quiet, as if the house was welcoming me too. But on the 7th night, something changed. I had just started to drift off when a soft, eerie melody wafted through the walls, barely above a whisper, a lullaby. It was faint but unmistakable, each note slow and haunting. I sat up, my heart pounding as I listened, unsure if I was hearing things or if there was truly music in my new home. After a few moments, the melody faded, leaving only silence. "It's an old house," I murmured to myself, lying back down. Old houses make noise. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just some creaky floorboard or whistling pipe. The second night, it happened again. The same haunting lullaby, drifting through the walls like a ghostly memory. This time it didn't stop. I sat up, straining to hear, my heart racing. The melody was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I got out of bed, pulling a sweater tightly around myself, and opened the door a crack. The hallway was dimly lit by the faint glow of moonlight spilling through a small, dusty window. And there, in the center of the hallway, was a figure, a woman swaying gently from side to side, humming softly to herself. She wore a tattered, old-fashioned dress that hung off her shoulders like it was clinging to her, and her hair was stringy and matted. Her face was obscured as she looked down, cradling something in her arms, her body rocking with the lullaby's rhythm. A chill ran through me. I should have backed away, closed the door, and hidden under my covers. But I was transfixed, almost hypnotized by her swaying form and that strange, sweet melody. My feet moved forward of their own accord, carrying me closer to the apparition. As I approached, the humming stopped abruptly, and she looked up, meeting my gaze. Her eyes were hollow, deep voids that seemed to draw me in, trapping me in their emptiness. Her mouth stretched slowly into an unnatural, twisted grin, each corner pulling wider and wider until it looked as though her face might split in two. "Come," she whispered, her voice echoing in the silence. "Come hold her for me." A nauseating chill swept through my body as she extended her arms toward me, revealing what she'd been cradling, a bundle wrapped in old, faded cloth. The cloth was stained, discolored with age and something else. The bundle moved, shifting slightly in her arms, and a faint, muffled whimper sounded from within. I stumbled back, my throat dry, every instinct screaming at me to run. But the woman's hollow gaze held me in place. "Please," she whispered, her voice raspy, almost pleading. "Just hold her for a moment." Before I could stop myself, I found my arms extending toward her. It was as though I were no longer in control of my own body, as if some force were guiding my movements. My fingers closed around the cold, heavy bundle, and the woman released it into my arms with a sigh of relief. As soon as I felt the weight of it, the true horror sank in. The bundle writhed, shuddering as though something alive were trapped inside. I dared to pull back the cloth just an inch, just enough to see a tiny, pale hand, shriveled and still. Then, without warning, the hand twitched, grasping weakly at the air. A strangled scream escaped my throat, and I dropped the bundle, stumbling back. It hit the floor with a sickening thud, the cloth unraveling to reveal the face of a tiny, twisted infant. Its eyes were wide open, staring blankly up at me, its mouth stretched in an eerily similar grin to the woman's. The air grew thick with the smell of rot. But when I looked up, the woman was gone. The hallway was empty, save for the faint, echoing notes of the lullaby drifting through the walls once more. I stumbled back into my room, slammed the door, and locked it, as if that flimsy lock could keep her out. All night, I lay awake, listening to the soft hum of the lullaby echoing outside my door. The next morning, in the harsh light of day, I tried to tell myself it had been a nightmare, a trick of my mind. But as I walked down the hallway, I saw faint, dusty footprints leading from my door to the spot where the woman had stood. And when I glanced back at the place where I had dropped the bundle, I noticed a dark stain on the floorboards, as if something had soaked into the wood. Days passed, each night bringing that same haunting lullaby. I began to dread sundown, knowing she would come again, swaying and humming, waiting for me to hold her terrible burden. The sleepless nights took their toll, and I felt my sanity slipping with each passing day. One evening, desperate for answers, I went to the local library. Searching through records about the house, I finally found something buried in old newspaper clippings from nearly a century ago. The tragic story of a young woman named Margaret Whitaker. She'd lived in the house with her newborn daughter, but after the baby's mysterious death, she'd gone mad, insisting that the child was still alive. Neighbors reported hearing her singing lullabies late into the night, cradling an empty bundle. Eventually, she'd vanished without a trace, and the house had sat abandoned for decades. It all made sense now. The lullaby, the bundle, her desperate plea for someone to hold her lost child. But knowing didn't make it any easier. That night, as the familiar melody began, I made a decision. I would face her, try to end this nightmare once and for all. I stepped into the hallway, the lullaby louder than ever. There she was, swaying and humming, her hollow eyes waiting for me. This time I didn't flinch as she extended the bundle toward me. I reached out, my hands trembling, and held it once more. "Please," I whispered, "let her rest." The woman's grin faded, replaced by an expression of sorrow. She gazed at the bundle, a tear slipping down her hollow cheek, and nodded slowly. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, the woman's form began to fade, dissolving into the soft morning air. The lullaby grew fainter, each note drifting away until there was only silence. The bundle grew lighter in my arms until it, too, disappeared, leaving me standing alone in the empty hallway. That was the last I saw of her. The house returned to its quiet self, the sense of a haunting lifting as the days went by. But even now, on restless nights, I sometimes hear the faintest echo of a lullaby in the walls, like a mother's ghostly voice, singing her child to sleep. The old inn stood against the bleak backdrop of the woods, a place that seemed to belong to a different era. The locals had hinted at odd occurrences but said it with an unsettling ease, as though they'd resigned themselves to the inn's mysteries long ago. It was charmingly eerie, with winding staircases and creaky wooden floors. My room, at the end of a dark, narrow hallway, was decorated with antique furniture, each piece worn but elegant, heavy with history. I almost missed the oddity in the mirror the first time I noticed it. I had tossed my bag on the bed, the mattress creaking under the weight, and looked into the mirror to adjust my hair after the drive. But as I peered into the glass, I saw only the room's contents reflected back. There was the heavy oak bed, the dark dresser, the dimly lit table with its dusty lamp, yet no sign of me. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, even waved a hand in front of the mirror, but nothing changed. It was as if I were invisible to it. Puzzled, I chalked it up to some trick of old glass. Maybe the mirror was worn or warped. It was strange, yes, but not entirely unheard of. With a dismissive shrug, I let it go and turned to explore the rest of the room. As evening deepened, I decided to call it a night. I switched off the bedside lamp, plunged the room into darkness, and pulled the heavy quilt around me. It was then, just as I was drifting off, that I heard it, a faint, raspy breathing. It was so close, it seemed to come from just over my shoulder, slow and almost familiar. I froze, my heart pounding, but told myself it was my own breath, echoing in the silence of the room. But the breathing continued, so close I could almost feel the air moving across my neck. Summoning a burst of courage, I sat up and stared around the room. In the dim glow of the street lamp outside, my eyes fell upon the mirror. What I saw there made my blood run cold. In the reflection, I was still lying in bed, staring up with wide, unblinking eyes. My reflection's face was pale, mouth open in a silent scream. A chill spread over my skin as I stared, rooted in place. The figure in the mirror lay motionless, lifeless. I wanted to believe it was just a nightmare, a figment of my tired mind. But it didn't fade. And then, to my horror, the reflection began to sit up, its limbs moving slowly, almost mechanically. I could feel every inch of my skin prickling as the figure in the mirror moved with dreadful precision until it was sitting in the bed, staring directly at me. Unable to tear my eyes away, I watched as my reflection lifted a pale, trembling hand and pointed directly at me, its lips curling into a twisted, mocking smile. I scrambled out of bed, heart racing, and backed against the door, trying to force myself awake, telling myself this wasn't real. But there it was, staring at me with an intensity that was almost mocking, as if it knew something I didn't. The figure stood up, mirroring my own movements, its eyes glinting with a cold, hungry look. It began to walk toward the edge of the mirror's glass, inching closer until it looked like it might step out of the frame. I fumbled behind me for the doorknob, desperate to leave, but my fingers wouldn't find it. My gaze stayed locked on the mirror as the figure pressed its hands against the glass, as if testing a barrier. I thought it would break through and walk into my room. Then, it whispered barely a sound, a cold breath that echoed in my mind, "You took my place." The words hit me with a sickening realization. I'd heard tales of spirits, reflections, doubles trapped in mirrors. I'd always brushed them off as old folklore, tales to frighten children. But now, with the thing in the mirror glaring at me, I wondered if I was the one who didn't belong here. If somehow I had taken this entity's place. Panicked, I hurled myself backward, finally gripping the doorknob and stumbling out into the hallway. I ran, my footsteps echoing down the corridors, which now seemed to stretch endlessly. I felt its presence close behind me, as if it were right at my back, and dared not look around, terrified of what I might see. Bursting into the lobby, I saw the innkeeper, an old woman with deep-set eyes and a blank expression. She didn't look surprised to see me, disheveled and breathless. She just tilted her head with that same unsettling calm. "Something wrong, Mr. Cooper?" she asked, her voice as smooth as silk. The mirror. In my room," I stammered, pointing down the hallway. "Oh, room 13's mirror." She chuckled lightly, as if I'd just mentioned some harmless quirk. "We don't get many guests willing to stay there more than a night." She said it with a strange pride, as if daring me to stay longer. But the mere thought of going back into that room made my stomach churn. I could still feel the reflection's cold gaze, hear its whisper. I turned back to the lobby door, needing to get as far from this place as possible. "Leaving already?" she called after me. "Your reflection might be lonely, don't you think?" I froze, realizing what she meant, but I couldn't bear to turn back. I pushed open the door and ran into the night, not stopping until the inn was far behind me, its windows dark and watchful against the night sky. As I drove away, the strangest sensation crept over me. My own hands gripping the wheel felt different. My face, as I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror, seemed slightly unfamiliar. My reflection wore a wide, haunted grin that felt separate from the panic I felt inside. And then I understood. It had taken my place after all. I don't usually stay late at the office, but that night, a stack of unfinished reports kept me chained to my desk well past midnight. The building was old, with flickering lights and the faint scent of mildew seeping from the walls. The hum of computers and the clacking of my own typing were the only sounds in the stillness. Lost in my work, I barely registered the first echo of footsteps coming down the corridor. They were faint at first, soft, as though someone were padding slowly across the carpeted hallway. I paused, listening, but the footsteps stopped. Probably just the creak of an old floorboard, I thought, forcing myself to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. But as I resumed typing, the footsteps started again. This time, they were louder, heavier, drawing closer with each deliberate step. They seemed to stop right outside my door. The silence that followed felt thick, tense, as though someone were standing there, just beyond the thin barrier of wood, listening. I stood, my heart pounding in my chest, and crept toward the door. Every instinct told me to leave it closed, but curiosity overruled my better judgment. Slowly, I turned the handle and yanked it open, my breath catching as I peered into the empty hallway. No one. The lights flickered slightly, casting eerie shadows along the corridor, but the space was entirely deserted. Shaking my head, I closed the door and tried to brush it off. Just nerves, I told myself. It was late, I was tired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I sat back down, pulling the computer monitor closer to focus on the words on the screen. Then, the footsteps resumed. Only this time, they were louder, faster, as though someone were rushing down the hall. They stopped abruptly outside my door again. My heart raced as silence filled the room. I could feel an inexplicable tension building, pressing in on me like an invisible weight, and then a whisper. "Jake?" It was barely audible, a ghostly hiss drifting through the silence, but it was unmistakably my own name. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but again, I was alone. I forced out a shaky laugh, trying to break the silence. "All right, Jake," I muttered to myself, "you're losing it. Just get through these reports and get home." But something felt wrong. I could feel it, as if I were being watched, as though someone were there with me, lurking just out of sight. The building felt alive, the shadows stretching and twisting around me. I tried to focus on the screen, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. Outside, the city was quiet, the streetlights casting a dull glow against the black sky. Then I noticed it. My reflection in the window. The faint outline of my own face stared back at me, but something was wrong. My reflection was smirking. I blinked, convinced I was seeing things, but as I looked closer, I saw it clearly. My reflection's lips were curled into a twisted, mocking smile, a grin that didn't match the terror I felt coursing through my veins. Its eyes gleamed with something cold and malevolent, something that wasn't me. I took a step back, breaking eye contact with it, and the reflection in the window seemed to lean forward, pressing closer against the glass. I looked back at my monitor, trying to avoid the window, but I could feel its gaze, sense its smirk lingering in the corner of my vision. Finally, unable to bear it, I turned and saw my reflection raise a hand, even though I was standing perfectly still. The hand pressed against the glass, leaving a faint, misty print as it curled into a fist. It knocked once, twice, 3 times, each thud resonating through the silence. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could only stand there, transfixed as the reflection's smirk widened, its eyes narrowing with glee, and then it spoke. "Let me in." The words echoed in my mind, though its lips hadn't moved. I backed away, feeling the wall press against my spine, my hands fumbling blindly for anything to defend myself with. I grabbed a stapler from the desk, my grip so tight my knuckles turned white, though I knew it would be useless against whatever was lurking in that glass. As I stared, the reflection began to change. The face in the window twisted, the skin growing pale and waxy, the eyes sinking back into dark, hollow sockets. It looked like me, but wrong, as though some dark version of myself had slipped out, wearing my face as a mask. "Let me in," it whispered again, its voice dripping with a sinister sweetness. "You're all alone, Jake. No one will even notice." The last words slithered through my mind, filling me with a dread that was bone deep. The reflection tilted its head, watching my every move with a sick fascination. I stumbled toward the door, desperate to get out, to flee. I grabbed the handle, yanking it open, but the hallway outside was no longer empty. There, in the dim light, stood figures, dozens of them, shadowy and silent, their eyes gleaming with the same cold malice that shone in my reflection's gaze. They lined the hallway, watching me, grinning that same eerie smile. "Jake," they whispered in unison, their voices merging into a low, chilling hum. "Come join us." I backed away, retreating into the office, slamming the door shut. My mind was racing, searching for any escape, any way out of this nightmare. I turned back to the window, and to my horror, the reflection was gone. But then, the lights in the room began to flicker, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. A voice whispered from the corner, so soft it was barely audible. "You invited me in, Jake. I've been waiting." I whipped around, and there, standing in the shadow, was me. Or rather, something that looked like me, its grin too wide, its eyes too empty. It stepped closer, mirroring every slight movement of my body, until we stood face to face, mere inches apart. It raised a hand, fingers curling around my wrist, its grip ice cold. My body went numb, my mind sinking into darkness as I felt it press closer, the thing wearing my face, its eyes consuming me. In those last moments, I felt myself slipping away, my thoughts becoming hazy, distant, like a radio signal fading into static. The last thing I saw was that smirking, twisted reflection leaning in, whispering with my own voice. "Thank you, Jake. I've been waiting so long to come out." And then there was only silence. The next morning, when the office doors opened, no one noticed anything unusual. Jake was sitting at his desk, typing away, a faint smirk on his lips, his eyes gleaming with a strange, unsettling light.